Again, our special thanks to the trustees of the Grimshaw Gooderitz Charitable Foundation for sponsoring the series. It's also my opportunity to extend thanks to both Michael and Dennis for their fine work in putting the series together, and to thank Stephanie Corey for her great help with the visual presentations. If you're not already a member of the Historical Society, we certainly invite you to join, and we have applications over on the table. The lecture this evening is titled Fall River's First Professional Base Ballists, presented by Professor Philip Sylvia, Jr. Phil, a graduate of Providence College in Fordham in 1973, and Professor Emeritus of History at Bridgewater State University, is the city's unofficial history historian for all things Fall River. This evening, the focus is on the story of early professional baseball in Fall River, how the game was being played in the 1870s, and the talented players who spent their early years playing in this city. Phil?
Play ball. Hello, play ball.
Oh, Phil reminded me. I was supposed to say, play ball.
All right. Thank you, Jay. Let's have some fun. I want to particularly acknowledge President Sprague is here this evening and has always been supportive, and under his leadership, the college is doing a superb job. All right, we're going to talk about the period. Here you go, Stephanie. Okay, so baseball was becoming popular, and we were taught then and now to keep our eyes on the ball. I'm not sure this umpire is looking to keep his eyes on the ball. This is a picture of a 1790 Pittsfield account. Baseball was being played in Pittsfield as early as 1790. The Duke of Marlborough was playing a form of baseball back in 1749. But that gets us into the real issue. This is Henry Chadwick, often called the father of baseball, and he was immigrant born, and he always proclaimed that the game of baseball was something that evolved from an earlier game called rounders. So this is really a battle between evolutionists and creationists. And the evolutionists have it best. And he wrote extensively about the kind of games that were played on an informal basis, 1-cat, 2-0-cat, etc. And part of that involved, of course, we've all experienced this as kids, plunking one another to procure an out and getting a stinger in the process. Chadwick grew old, and in the end, it was interesting. He worked for Albert Spaulding. Spaulding's Sporting Guide was edited by Chadwick, but they certainly had a confrontation prior to that, as I'll get into. This is the monument to Chadwick, honoring his efforts to promote the game of baseball as a sports writer. You can see it's pretty noticeable that someone was associated with baseball, according to what they did for him. And this is one of his works that became a manual that was helpful in, again, guiding people to an appropriate way of playing the game. Now, Fall River was celebrating Old Tap in 1939, and they weren't celebrating what Chadwick believed in. They were celebrating the idea that Abner Doubleday, who we just saw, had founded the game at Cooperstown in 1839. That's an absolute myth, as I think probably most of you that are involved in baseball history would understand. But there were different ways that were suggested for playing the game, and Massachusetts played the game differently than it was played in New York. Those are the two major areas, and this is our earliest photo of a game on the Boston Common being played well before the middle of the 19th century. The game, again, was being designed in different phases, and you heard about the Massachusetts game, you heard about the New York game. But it was this man, the father of modern baseball, Alexander Joy Cartwright, that really set most of the rules that we play the modern game under, that uncanny 90 feet between bases, for instance. And he was working for a Knickerbocker club in 1845. This was a club of gentlemen, proper gentlemen that had white-collar positions and could take time from work, were supposed to develop the game. And he developed these rules, and these rules became very popular as we moved toward the Civil War. And the game caught on in college, and this is supposed to be a pre-Civil War depiction of a game between Amherst and Williams. Amherst slaughtered Williams, and then Williams sought revenge by saying, okay, now we'll play a game of chess. But Now, notice the Harvard team at Niagara Falls. We'll be getting back to the Falls later, but the Harvard team at this period could play pretty effectively with the best teams unless they were a very special professional team, and that special professional team would be the Cincinnati Red Stockings. James Creighton was the first star pitcher who was really being paid professionally in the early 1860s, a great batter, as you can see, as well as a superb pitcher. He crossed home plate one time and said that his belt snapped. Unfortunately for him, it was worse than that. He suffered internal injuries at that moment and died. But the national game was very well accepted by the time of the Civil War and certainly shortly thereafter. And it was made so in 1869 when the great Cincinnati Red Stockings toured the country and were taking on all comers, East Coast, West Coast. And they returned after a season of never being defeated. They went out on the West Coast and they played 5 games in California. They prevailed by a total of 283 runs to 23. They always carried 6 guns under their pillowcases. I mean, this is the Wild West in 1869. But they were a legendary team, and the stars of the team were people who had started out as cricketers. The person on the right seated is Harry Wright. Below him is his great playing brother George Wright, and that's Albert Goodwill Spaulding, the star pitcher for the Cincinnati team in 1869. Harry Wright is the grand old man of the professional game. He really is the father of the professional game as a manager and as a player. And this is a very nice picture because seated at the very right where I've got the arrow is his great friend and a person who played for him, and that's none other than Fora's own Charlie Buffington. This is a slugger that would have intimidated any 19th century pitcher. But no, I had to follow wonderful Harry Wright. After following his correspondence at the New York Public Library, I found my way to Laurel Hill Cemetery outside of Philadelphia to pay homage to the great Harry Wright. And what happened under Harry Wright and others, there was a National Association of Baseball Players, amateurs. In 1871, they had developed the National Association of Professional Baseball Players. So the professionals had, in a sense, trumped the amateurs by 1871, and they set up their own league, and they dominated the league. And you can see the kind of structures that would have existed, somewhat elemental, in the 1870s. This is a very interesting picture of a game by the professional players, especially because the pitcher is doing something that is illegal at the time. He's supposed to be throwing from below his waist, but he obviously has released it at a higher point. And just notice the catcher. We'll be getting to that in a minute. So this professional league played through 1876, and Spaulding was the star of the league. But Spaulding had a motto: everything is possible to him who dares. And Albert Spaulding and one of his friends broke away from the Players Club, and they began the National League of professional baseball clubs in 1976, which we recognize as the first major league. So ownership, in a sense, had taken control over or from the professional players. And Spalding, playing a game a little past his prime, but grew older and was immensely successful. He was nicknamed the Messiah for his piety especially, but I think one of his gods was money. And he developed the famous Spalding and Brothers enterprise, and again, he had the inside because he was the great pitcher and he had all the contacts, so he sold his product to the National League, and that helped to promote his products. So Spalding and his balls, etc., represented the new emerging American economy that was connected to pastimes and sport. So that basically takes us to this time frame of the 1870s, where we'll be talking about where the game was laid out pretty much as we know it today. So we're going to pick up then in Fall River with the game being played in 1874. There's no professionals in Fall River in 1874, but there's some pretty good rivalries. And Steph, you might want to take over at this point. East of Oak Grove Avenue was what was called Doctor's Meadow, which certainly was named for Dr. Nathan Durfee. And there was a team of Yankee players, the Quickershans, that were playing there. And they had the old Yankee names that we recognize. There was a Holmes, an Ellsbury, a Jennings, a Mason, a Dunning, a Remington, and a Benjamin Cook. Their rival team became the Irish team. The Irish are the post-war upstarts. And we have William Conley, now attorney William Conley, home from My Fordham. And he organizes the team, and one of the players on the team is Tom Conley. And they go at it in 1866. They have a major match late on Thanksgiving Day, and the Irish beat the Yankees 33-27. So that must have caused a great deal of consternation among the old Yankee class. What we find over the next couple of years is games are being played real and for hard. A lot of money changed hands, is one report. And then my favorite, there's a game between New Bedford and the Conley team. And the game ended in the fourth inning when Tom Conley, my great-grandfather, poked a sliding New Bedford player on the nose with the ball. And it caused a riot. So this heated rivalry between New Bedford sports and Fall River sports can go back to my great-grandfather in the late 1860s, and boy, am I proud of that. The greatest athletic feat that occurred in the early years was by one Tom Birtwell, who, playing for the Anawans, came up to a game in which his team was behind in the last inning by 2 runs, 21-19, and with 2 outs, he hit 15 foul balls and then a 3-run homer to win the game. So he might be our first star of note. In 1874, we really begin to see baseball being very important in the city, and there are several teams. The first and the ultimately predominant team was called the Resolutes, and they played against a team of cricket players that was organized by William Burgess, who had a store near South Park. And they had a very nice rivalry. They decided to have a competition out on 8 Rod Way on Plymouth Avenue. And so the Resolutes played baseball and beat the Cricketeers by something like 74-2. And then they had a nice lunch together, and then they played a game of cricket, and the cricket players prevailed. There are other interesting things. There's more leisure developing in the sport. One of the interesting things related to the war is some people walked from downtown Fall River and they went out to the Sandbar, as it was called, in South Watuppa, and they set up a target. And the winner hit the target from 125 yards with all 5 shots and won a prize, a gold prize that was the equivalent of winning $720 today. So money's starting to factor into sporting competition. There were major battles between the Acushnet team and of New Bedford and some of the Fall River teams. And interestingly, on the 4th of July, the New Bedford city government put up the equivalent of $1,000 to sponsor a game. So the game is getting professionalized. The winning team would win $600, the losing team $400. Toward the end of the season, the Troys had a big game, they were led by Andy Jennings. And Jennings was sick for the big game, and the team lost without his presence. But Jennings might not have made the difference, because 2 years ago, before this game, he had pitched a game in which he gave up 76 runs. Andrew Jennings. I always like to say, you think he would have acquitted himself better on defense. And at least he learned to get used to a long trial. But he lost, and interestingly, one of the people that scored 9 runs against him when he gave up 76 runs was a Knowlton. Now, it wasn't Hosea, but I'm sure the name Knowlton upset Jennings for the rest of his life and said, I'm going to get back at this guy sometime, and he certainly did in a trial. One of the interesting things was New Bedford came over with a wagon full of players with Mazeppa on the buckboard side. And Mazeppa was this famous play in starring sort of the it girl of the day. So there's a sort of a sexiness associated with the players. And this was Adam Menken. And she performed to the delight of men on the European continent and here. And there's one great play where they create a platform, a wooden platform. She's supposed to be going up into a mountain, and they'd put her in flesh-covered tights, and they'd strap her to the horse, and the horse would really run up the stage at the end of the play, very dramatically. Out west when it played, the Cowboys got excited. They took out their 6 guns and fired them into the ceiling. So quite interesting. Toward the end of the season, there was talk about how indeed baseball was becoming the national pastime at all levels, and fire companies started to compete against one another, and they were always talking about, we're so happy to be playing in the national pastime. So it really has caught on as America's sport. But again, those that are playing for something are getting better than those that aren't playing for something. And so at the end of the season, they advertised a silver-mounted rosewood bat, and that was something that the 2 best teams fought over, and there was a real dispute, dark and threatening clouds about who had scored the game-winning run. But in the end, the Resolutes prevailed, and the Resolutes, I would say, was the undefeated champions of 1874. But again, they're good. There's no professionals playing for them. This all changes in 1875. 1875 begins to be one of the big years in Fall River baseball professional history. By July 4th, you have this fellow, Billy McGonigal, Gunnar McGonigal, who has come from Brockton and is playing for the Fall River team, and in fact is quite a character right from the beginning. When he scored his first home run, he somersaulted crossing home plate. Now, the Resolutes were good enough to go up and play a game against the world champion Bostons. And again, we get to see, I think, 2 pictures, Stephanie, of what the ballpark of the National League team would look like, especially 1876. And it's, again, pretty rudimentary, so we can imagine that when a ballpark is built in Fall River, it's also going to be rather basic. But at least they had the great team. And Spalding is coming to town. After that, Spalding is coming to town to play against Fall River. And I wait, and I'm so excited. Spalding's record is 71-8, or the team record is 71-8 for the season. And when Fall River plays against them, they lose 10-1. But Spalding says the boys are pretty good if the Fall River guys, and he says, and McGonigal's very good. He got two of the hits off me. Right after that, and this is very interesting, we get to black baseball. Fall River teams wanted black teams to play, and the first team that played was the Mutual Colored Club, considered the national champions of black teams. They came up from Washington, and there was a little bit of the Harlem Globetrotter in playing them. They talked about they will amuse you at the time, and they played a couple of games against the best that Fall River had, the Resolutes and the Fall Rivers. The game against the Fall Rivers was delayed for a half hour to find one satisfactory baseball. But they said many families came and many ladies attended. And if you see the next, this is Sarah Lewis, and I've done a research on her, and Sarah Lewis was Bridgewater State's first African-American graduate. And when she finished in 1869, she was hired to teach in the Fall River school system. So my point was, in an age of vicious racism, here in Fall River, we were welcoming black teams and playing competitively against them. And it was announced that there was cheering on both sides. The other thing that is happening is that as the games become more sophisticated and better played, injury, because of lack of equipment, comes to predominate, and you begin to have even trainers looking at least the semi-pro teams. And there's a famous train accident at this time where a physician goes on board the train and he sees all these people are hurt, so he sees a person with a gnarled hand. He says, "I'm going to get out some splints and help you." And the guy says, "Get lost, I'm the catcher for the Chicago White Sox." You know, so, but again, this is a problem, and you're constantly reading the cost, especially for catchers. Catcher of Fall River out, hand lamed. Catcher of the Mutuals got a rap on the nose from a ball that set him right about for a whole season. Quite a number of cases of lameness and aching fingers. At a lesser level, it was announced that the 9-year-old son of the Tiverton superintendent of schools was hit in the face by a bat that one of his teammates let go. So that caused consternation, and it caused an editorial, "The sport has certain barbarous qualities." So there would be benumbed fingers, et cetera, and this finally led on to people really, I would suggest objectively, needing protection. So we begin to have that protection, and this guy was with Jack Nicholson in One Flew Over a Cuckoo's Nest. Now he got banged by a couple of wire masks that he had been wearing that didn't work too well. This is the picture that we wanted to associate with the 9-year-old having his problem, so we can keep going stuff.
Okay.
Harvard was the team that finally decided to use protective equipment, and the best pitcher of the day, wanted his battery mate to be someone who was out in the outfield. So he got him a glove, and he got him a mask. And things became very controversial because the first time the Harvard kid wore the mask, the player on the other team looked at it and threw it down on the ground in disgust, saying, who would use a bird cage like that? But slowly over time, in fact, McGonigal was the one that used bricklayers' gloves in a Fall River game. And that might be really the start. Our own Billy McGonigal might very well have been the person that started to give catchers the protection that they needed. Okay, stop. And of course, this helped Spalding. And initially, a lot of the fingers are just cut off gloves, et cetera, et cetera. And it developed over time. The infield didn't really use gloves besides first base until the 1890s. The first baseman was using it, and the catchers began using it, and then they got really, they really liked what was happening. So now sometimes they wore 2 gloves, and It's great for helping your hands. It might not be too good for throwing the guy out going to second. So there were some trade-offs there. Now, the other thing that happened in 1875, besides concern about injuries, was the season started with this fellow, the old cricketer, moving over and getting involved in being the head of the Fall River Baseball Association. And he had several people with him. Most importantly, by the end of the year, the Fall River Baseball Club had been created, and it had grounds to the east of the Merchant's Mill. It was an open lot to the east of the Merchant's Mill, and we'll talk about that later. And they had, the Fall River Baseball Club, by the end of 1875, had this remarkable Lyman Dean. Now, Lyman Dean is listed as a music teacher, but he was the reporter, I believe, that constantly told us how the Fall River professional players were doing, and he could be very acidic in his criticism. But what happened was he signed between 12 and 15 professional players to contracts. Some say as many as 25. He was considered to have such ability as a scout and an evaluator of talent that some teams from around the country would send him blank checks and have him fill in an amount to go play for the team that has sent the check. So that really strengthens Fall River's position to have Lyman Dean doing the evaluation. There's a fellow named Jefferson Valentine, who was the first real professional promoter in any sport that Fall River had. And McGonigal, recognizing Valentine's ability as a director, induced Valentine to put together one of the best teams in the country for the next season, 1876. And so this is what we had going for us going into 1876. McGonigal said, as we entered the centennial year, that Fall River is as ripe for a pro team as Boston, that we could continue the path that we were on. Now, the reality is that's not likely. As a social historian, you see, yes, the city had tripled to 45,000 people by 1875, but we're in the midst of a terrible depression that's going to last until 1878, and the city population is going to be almost flatlined over the next few years, the late 1870s. People are in almost a state of revolution. They're seething about the deaths and the wounded at the Granite Mill fire in 1874. There's terrible, terrible wage cuts totaling some 45%. So there aren't a lot of people that could have afforded to go to games. And most of the adult population is working well into the evening because it's a 10 or more hour workday, and the games are being played typically at 3 o'clock. Half the population is foreign born. So there's just some demographics that work against Fall River and McGonigal's long-term optimistic projection. But in 1876, things are going to work out just fine. They developed, at the time, obviously built for the nation to celebrate the centennial. The Academy building and the Academy of Music was being created. And the manager of the Academy of Music was also very, very much involved in arranging for the trips that the team would be taking when they left Fall River. The result was that Valentine did develop a powerhouse team. Fall River has a powerhouse team in 1876. There are people like Sam Crane that we'll talk about, Jim Moutry, and others that join the team. The grounds were considered to be in excellent condition. There was the telegraph was extended to the ballpark by Western Union, so all games could be connected and even sent around the country. Jefferson Valentine made sure that they had nice uniforms. Not that one. But the Fall River uniforms that were selected in 1876 for the Fall Rivers were actually all white with red stockings and a patriotic belt of blue and siding. So red, white, and blue, very, very patriotic. Woolen shirts must have been very much appreciated. There was one game played in 97-degree shade. But they got in their fancy uniforms, and they had the best of fields, and they went off, and they're playing a team from Brown. They have a very good game. They say it's the best game that's ever been played in Fall River in the early spring. Then Taunton. Taunton is always competitive, and their fans arrive, and they all are shouting in unison, "We can beat this one-horse club from this one-horse town." And they have a strong rivalry. The games get a little bit dirty. Crane, our second baseman, was intercepted while making a double play by Dixon of Taunton, who has a mean trick of running into players. At any rate, our captain was putting a new pitcher, Egan, in, and Egan began to pitch very, very well. And when he pitched, he gained great support. If a ball was knocked on the ground, it was captured by Moutry or Crane, and Libby received it kindly. Again, an effort to bring a black team to town was successful, and yet they used the African vernacular in an offensive way to advertise the team. It went something like this in the newspaper: "Dat fust baser is worth the price of admission. Boss Shine will take care of the first, and Lafayette Washington is the funny man on dat third base. The biggest audience of the season will be there to enjoy the fun." Again, this is the centennial year, and in June of 1776, the champion baseball team of the world came from Chicago. This is the team with Spaulding and White. Deacon White, you might have read, is being inducted into the Hall of Fame this summer. He was the catcher, member of the Flat Earth Society, and Ross Bonds was the best player in the opening season for the NL. Cap Anson was a legendary player. Come see them, they each wear a colored hat. That was weighted to identify because there were no numbers or names on the uniforms. 20,000 saw them play in Boston last week, so we expect a large crowd in Fall River for the big game, and Spaulding will pitch, and the big game came. And I read the newspaper, and there was no account. Okay? The frustration of research. The tag-along reporter wasn't there or was told not to submit his account. So that was a disappointment. Late in June, it was announced that the Fall River Mills would close for a week, carrying through the 4th of July, and the Fall Rivers would try to play a game every day. One of the games was going to be up against the Hartford Charter Oaks. Okay, so this is a major league caliber team. As an aside, Mark Twain had gone to see the Hartford team play Boston the previous year, and then he had put in the Hartford Courant this ad, leave it to Twain: $205 reward at the great baseball match. While I was engaged in hurrahing, a small boy walked off with an English-made brown silk umbrella belonging to me and forgot to bring it back. I will pay $5 for the return of the umbrella in good condition. I do not want the boy back in an active state, but we'll pay $200 for his remain. Samuel Clemens. Well, Fall River enjoyed a brilliant game on the 4th of July of our centennial year and handily defeated this team and beat them again the next day by a handsome score. So Fall River could play with the best, it seemed. The next team to arrive of great significance would be the celebrated Mutuals of Brooklyn, again a National League team. The game was evenly played. The Mutuals prevailed 3-2. In early September, another team from Hartford, but this was the team that was now in the new National League of 1876. The celebrated Hartfords arrived with the great pitcher of the country, and there he is, Tommy Bond. Tommy Bond will go 31-13 that season, 1876, and then in the next 3 seasons he'll win in excess of 40 games in each of those seasons, the only major league pitcher to have ever had that accomplishment. Candy Cummings was another pitcher on the same team, and it's Candy Cummings that first watched people down at the seashore throw clamshells and saw them curve, and that had assisted him in developing a curveball. So he is famous as the first curveball thrower, but he taught Bond the pitch, and that added to Bond's repertoire. So very, very successful team. And the game was won 4-2 by the National League team, but all 4 runs were unearned, and Fall River again basically played even. Now later in the season, they went to Boston, and they played on the National League grounds, and the game was it was a very wet game. They delayed the game for an hour. The conditions were soggy. It was hard to field. And in the end, the game was played, and Fall River lost, again, to this National League team by 7-5. Late in the season, Fall River had acquired a new pitcher called Tricky Nichols. And Tricky was able to lead the Fall River team to a victory over the National League Boston Red Caps. So they basically did very, very well. Before I move on to this picture, there was a continuing problem with playing Harvard. Harvard had this Ernst, who was a great pitcher, but they also had a prudish president. And when Harvard came to play Fall River, the president threatened to stop the team from playing. He said, baseball and the curveball represent a low form of cunning. And then he read an account. Ernst, with the perpendicular, horizontal, bitchy, uneven style of delivery, succeeded in deceiving the batters. And the President Eliot would have none of that. I'm further instructed the purpose of the curveball is to deliberately deceive the batter. Harvard is not in the business of teaching deception. So that was that. Before this picture came up, in 1876, at the end of the season, Fall River played so well that it captured the New England Championship, which was one level below the National League. The plucky Fall Rivers have won the championship of New England with a record of 49, 33, and 1 drawn. They then had a big end of the year gathering at Music Hall, music by the 3rd Regiment Band, very largely attended both by participants in the Terpsichorean, somebody was in an enhancing vocabulary mood, exercises, and by spectators, several hundred of whom occupied the gallery. So it was a happy end to a brilliant season, the New England champions. The only problem was the Rhode Island's team was displeased, saying, we never send as many to Rhode Island as Rhode Island sends to play in Fall River. And there was also a report at the end of the season that New Bedford was organizing a professional club. The next great season, 1877. The dead ball of the era was considered so dead as to bury. And hopefully they were going to come up with a livelier ball for the season. And it was decided without spring training that Fall River would have another team. And they named it the Fall River Cascades. They named it after the Quakershans in 1877, and they joined the New England League with slightly different uniforms. They began early in the season playing a game with the flag flying out in center field, much to their joy, and they began selling tickets, trying to get people to come in large numbers. One of the uses of the game was people would leave from Bedford Street, Main Street on Bedford Street, and take conveyances out to the park. They almost had a Buffalo Bill show early in 1877. They used the grounds to bring in the greatest polo rider in the country from California and his polo team, but they also had wild Mustangs and Indians, etc. So people would have a non-baseball entertainment. They said the grounds were in great shape, but it was first-rate umbrella weather. So I'm not sure that it turned out to be as good a time as had been the case. The 1877 team are extraordinary as fielders. Captain Moutry will smile a lot this year. They also are, I think, the fastest team in baseball in the 19th century. And I think they could match up against any baseball team at any time. There never was a finer outfielding as was done by Mack and the boys. There was no stealing on Rowan, as he caught but few can catch. So they're very, very good. Libby crossed the plate like a deer. So they can field, they can hit. I mean, they can field and they can run. One big issue in 1877, the bats were very timid. So that's going to be their challenge. Now, early in the season, they played well. They played a 30-game, one-game stretch with their speed and defense. They only gave up 20 runs, which is just remarkable for this time, without gloves. And in late June, they actually scored a victory over the National League Boston team. And it was said Boston lifted their hats to the Fall Rivers. And Harry Wright speaks very highly of the Fall Rivers and tells visiting clubs not to expect a soft job in Fall River. Maybe the most exciting game of the season came in New Bedford, but it was a game against Providence. It had gone on for 14 innings, and the Atlantic and Pacific telegraph rooms in Fall River got the message. The message was, clicked, Mack a run. Mack had scored a run in the 14th inning. Fall River won 1-0, and they said a shout went up that could have been heard in New Bedford. So they've got a good team, but their pitcher, who came from the West, Johnson, has a problem. He allows his arm to go way back, and he throws too slowly, and they steal bases on him. And then he only throws fastballs, and he pummels the catches almost into extinction. One of the catches is noted as the unexcelled catching of Rowan. By the way, Eddie is held in great favor by the ladies in the audience. Well, in this year, the 4th of July, everything fell apart. They played a doubleheader. First game in Providence, second game in Fall River. They lost both games. McGonigal threw out 7 batters from right field to keep the game somewhat reasonably close. But basically, the team had lost faith in Johnson, and Johnson went back out west. They then got Mack. Mack was the great first athlete in Fall River. Everybody loved Mack. He's playing since 1875. He began practice pitching, and he defeated the #1 team in Massachusetts, Lowell. So he's doing pretty well. The only thing, one of his pitches hit Rowan in the face, and so Rowan wasn't maybe quite so pretty for the ladies after that had taken place. Chicago was the defending world champions coming into town in 1877. 2 very closely played matches, with the sports reporter saying, Chicago's narrowly escaped defeat, crawling out. And Spaulding's final remarks were, the boys play as finely as any of them. So this is an NL team impressed by what we have for quality. Well, late in the season, this always improving team went on a foreign soil trip. They went on a road trip to Upper New England, Upper New York, and into Canada. The problem was the 10th man. The 10th man was the home umpire in the cities they visited. So the Fall River team thought for sure that they should have been 11-0. They ended up okay at 8-2-1. But game after game was frustrating. The reporter that was with him, again, I think it's Lyman Dean, the umpire was bad as usual. The umpire made 2 particularly confused decisions. The umpire, as usual, did effective work in producing the result. Hanlon struck out on a ball higher than an elephant. So anyway, they're having this trip, and they need a little break in the action, so they go to Niagara. And Sunday at Niagara, they went with Conroy the guide, the whole team in bathing suits, rubber coats and hats, no rubber duckies. Under the falls at the American side, they were all delighted, impressed, and just a trifle frightened, and stayed for about 20 minutes at the extreme point of safety. They came out soaking wet, but alive and thankful. They then got on a train to take a trip to play Buffalo. It was a 34-mile journey. It took all night. It's the slowest train since the one we have coming from Boston to Fall River. And they had no sleeping cars, and they were in a very bad frame of mind. The 10th man was unusually exasperating. The whole 9 lost temper completely and kicked altogether, but of course without doing the least bit of good. Well, they got home, and they then announced late in the season they were running a shoestring operation. There was one person that was making contributions to keep things going, but it was reported they would have, like the previous season, one big dance and festive evening and then disband and go on to play for other teams. Again, the weakness had been in the batting, but in the middle of the season, they did acquire one great batter, and that was old piano legs, George Gore. George Gore, barefoot, out in Portland, had been watching Fall Rivers play Portland, and he asked if he could play, and he had 3 of the 5 Portland hits, and one of them traveled 450 feet in the air with a dead ball. So our captain, Moutry, recruited him, and he played the latter part of the season, batting .319 for Fall River, followed by Hanlon at .290, and then anemic averages that went all the way down to .190. Fall River finished with 48 wins, 34 losses, and 6 drawn. One of the games they forfeited, they were ahead, but they had to get the last 5 o'clock train back from New Bedford, so they forfeited the game. Or they would have had exactly the same one-loss record in '77 as they had in '76. So they had their great parade, and then there was nothing for the sports to follow unless you wanted to attend Greco-Roman female wrestling with sensational blondes. Now, if in 1878, Fall River was not going to have a professional team. It was that ephemeral. And the person responsible was Frank Bancroft. Bancroft owned a hotel, and in the spring of '78, what did he do? He brought the first great superhero player, George Wright, to New Bedford, and he rode the streets with 2 great mayors, and he introduced the great Wright to the fans, and they all followed him out to the park, and from that point on, the Frank Bancroft's team was the team that was going to play professionally around here. He took our captain Moutry and others, and they began playing. They played very well, and they won the Massachusetts State Championship, and later in the year they had a gathering which involved the Wrights. George Wright did an exhibition on a rowing machine, and Harry Wright did an English impersonation, an Irish impersonation of a black person. That must have been interesting. And then there was a 10-mile walk between Moutry and Gore, the former Fall River players. Pedestrianism was a big sport at the time. Back here in Fall River, the amateur games were being played and only drawing a couple of hundred fans. And basically, it looks like they won't be able to make any money. But they are creative, not in a baseball way. They decided that they were going to light the grounds at night. And so on a magic night in 1877, thousands of people came to Fall River, to the baseball grounds, and it was announced we had a new era of amusement in Fall River. Fall River has become a city of no mean pretensions. The carnival drew over 7,000 people. And the only snafu was one ticket booth. But I suppose the people got in before midnight. And there were all sorts of prizes for climbing grease poles and best dancer, et cetera, et cetera. And that hope that they could use that kind of lighting for baseball was something that the promoters talked about, but they never did. And so if they had been able to pursue that, maybe, we would have had night ball in the major leagues before 1935 when it finally came about. Banny Bancroft. Oh, yeah, I wanted to just talk about where they were playing ball. It can be to the east of the Merchant's Mill in this area, and it will be at a later time. But I'm thinking as I read this, and I need to go to look at the city records, but I think this is sort of a funny conglomeration of buildings that were put up by the professional teams in 1876 and 1877, because this is Bedford Street, and this is Oak Grove, and later we know that they did play there. So they were in one of these sites, and I'm still trying to finalize when they were at each of those two sites. Now, Banny Bancroft, just to jump on to him, took his New Bedford team on sort of a world tour. He went to the White House and visited President Hayes. He went to Cuba, and Banny Bancroft is considered to be the father of Cuban baseball. And he then moved on and played for Worcester. And again, he made the sport popular wherever he took it. He was a great promoter. We have no doubt that Mr. Bancroft could make a League 9 pay at Cuddy Hunk. Bancroft would ultimately manage 7 major league clubs. His first wife would die shortly after the period that we're talking about, and he later married a beautiful young woman, a pronounced brunette, that drew the attraction of all the writers whenever she was at the ballpark. A final note about Bancroft: he became the manager of the Provident Grays team in 1884, and this was the most famous season to date in history. He enjoyed the fact that his team won the World Championship. But if we just go on to the next slide, Steph. This is why Charlie Old Hoss Radburn won 59 games in 1884. Now, the reason he won so many games is because there was an excellent pitcher on his team, Charlie Sweeney, who actually struck out 19 people. This guy is the most cantankerous guy in the world, next to Charlie Sweeney. Charlie Sweeney has to drink a quart of whiskey a day, okay? And on one of the occasions, Frank Bancroft, Banny, wasn't convinced that he was ready to perform. And they had words. And Charlie Sweeney grabbed a prostitute on each arm and walked across the length of the field from the dugout and disappeared from the 1884 team, leaving Old Hoss with the challenge that, as we said, he succeeded in achieving. What we're going to do now, these are the players. I want to spend a few minutes just talking about the greatest of the players that came to Fall River for those few years. I could be talking about a bunch of them. Sam Crane became the Dean of American Sports Writers, and he actually said that he followed the entire career of Honus Wagner, that George Wright was the superior shortstop, that George Wright was the greatest shortstop he had ever seen. Hick Carpenter, who played third base for Fall River, in one game, you can imagine his hands, he caught 7 line drives. And that's when third base became called the hot corner. And Tricky Nichols ended up pitching in what Chadwick said was the greatest baseball game ever played through 1877 when he was writing the account, a 15-inning game that ended 0-0, but Nichols had only given up 2 hits in those 15 innings. So there's these guys that played in Fall River that did did some really interesting things at the major league level. So we're going to take a little break, and I'm going to talk little vignettes about 5 of them. 2 of them did it because of their baseball talent. 3 of them did it because they were superior managers. And it's remarkable in sum how much was accomplished by these people in terms of assisting Major League Baseball to become the great sport that it did become. Okay, so just, you got to stand up now, and we'll do a little stretching. These are the guys by position that played in Fall River and all made it to the major leagues. Okay, so these are some of the 14 players that made it to the major level that we're not going to talk about, but at least show their names, and you have the handout as well. Do we have some more from here?
Yeah,
Jim Egan, the cloud.
Okay.
Yeah, why is Jim Egan doesn't have a picture?
And
There isn't any picture of him.
that's that Hick Carpenter who I mentioned that caught 7 line drives in one game. And that's Sam Crane, who became the great sports writer. But this is the first of the 5 that we need to talk about. This is George Piano Legs Gore that we last found up in Maine. He ended up, after he left Fall River, working for Bancroft, and he was so good that Al Spalding came to Brockton to try to get a contract signed by Gore with the Chicago White Sox National League team. And Bancroft, even though he was going to lose his play, liked him so much that he told him to hold out. And some people think that George Gore was really the first contract holdout person. But at any rate, he did go off with Spalding, and he played for Spalding. And in 1880, Chicago won the pennant easily. Gore, our former Florida, Gore batted .360, and that gave him the batting title, and he also had the slugging percentage title. And this is in a year that pitchers had great advantages. Pitchers were throwing not from a mound, but from a box from 45 feet away. And they were so successful in 1880 that the next year the rules pushed them back 5 feet. But again, even with that advantage, he again had batted .360. He's a lifetime .301 hitter. He's the first major leaguer to have scored 1,000 runs. In his entire career, he averaged more than 1 run scored per game. And I put on my Williams shirt because Teddy, with all his power and with the powerful hitters behind him, never came close to achieving that. Ted was at .78 runs per game. So this guy did that in part because he was so fleet of foot. They said his base running is phenomenal. He was a person that had great discipline. He hardly ever struck out, maybe 300 times in 6,000 at-bats. He led the league in walks on several occasions. And better still, he was a complete player. He was a fine fielder and thrower. The famous outfield of King Kelly and George Gore and Abner Doubleday were considered to be as good, if not the best, of any in the 19th century. With his leadership, Chicago won 5 world championships in a 7-year span. And yet, for all his success, he played for a very straight-laced Cap Anson, who, in a ball player's career, would say that Gore was done in by wine and women. The last time I saw him, he was broken down, both in heart and pocket, and willing to work at anything that would yield him the bare necessities of life. One of the Chicago sports writers had a nickname for Gore, Budweiser. And he got no sympathy at all when he was hit off the skull by a Hoss Radburn fastball, because it was thought that he was too drunk to dodge the pitch. At any rate, he was traded to the Giants, acquired by his fellow Fall River teammate Jim Moutrie, and playing for the Giants, he would win 2 more pennants. So he played on 7 pennant winners in his 10-year career. The drinking got to be a factor, though, with the Chicago team. Detectives were hired to go after the lushers. And it was said that, you know, every team had drinkers, and it said sometimes when the bases were loaded, so was the pitcher. So they sent out a scout to look at Gore and the famous Mike Kelly, and then they had a showdown. Spalding got them in a room and said, hey, the detectives have been out, and you've been caught in the great elbow act of drinking. And you were spotted drinking lemonade in a saloon well beyond curfew at 3 o'clock. The ever honest Kelly said, I never drank a lemonade at that time in my life. It was straight whiskey. So he got traded, Gore got traded. Gore ended up marrying, but soon enough was living in a hotel in New York with a woman who wasn't Mrs. Gore. And so that ended in a bad divorce. He was a saloon keeper for a while and was at one point dismissed as mixing drinks in a Harlem saloon. But he righted himself, lived to 77, and served as a New York policeman. Great athlete. Roger Connor was certainly different than George. He was the good Connor. He was baseball's first great slugger. He was the Babe Ruth of the 1880s. They called him the Giant of the Giants because that's the team he played on. They called him, Bob Kitchen would like this, the Jumbo of the field. He's 6'3" and 230 pounds as he fills out. Massive for the time. He's supposed to have a boxing match at the old Madison Square Garden with John L. Sullivan, who becomes sick. For all his size, etc., he stole more than 20 bases a year. He actually developed the pop-up slide. And he was considered to be the hardest pitcher to strike out in the majors. He a free-swinging guy, but he only struck out once every 57 at-bats. And old Hoss Radburn said, Connor was the only guy I could never trick with any of my pitches. He led the majors in walks on several occasions. He was the #1 triples hitter in the 19th century and the #1 home run hitter. He hit 138 with a bat that you'll see in a minute that was called a small telephone pole. Now, I'll get to her for a minute. But he's also a terrific fielder. Bare hands, his fielding average one year was .993. And yet his best catch was, this was John Montgomery Ward's wife, who was an actress, and she was at a she was at a train station, and a steel beam came sliding down the roof and was falling directly to the top of her head. And Roger Connor spotted it and grabbed it, swatted it away, and presumably saved a life. Connor is a dignified, wonderful human being, nicknamed the Gentleman of the Giant. He's a very devout Catholic. Connors adopted a child that has been left at a church doorstep. But interesting, after one season, the Giants barnstorm out west to play a few games in San Francisco, and who does he encounter? The whiskey-guzzling, cowardly nincompoop Sweeney. Sweeney is back playing, and they end up having a fist fight, and Connor gets the worst of it, and he says he's coming hunting for Sweeney says he's coming hunting for Connor. Connor says, I feel a little bit homesick. So he heads back east just in time, because Connor then would have heard that Sweeney was thrown in jail for whipping a streetcar conductor. Then he beat a patron in a saloon. And then he shot and killed an opponent and was put in San Quentin for manslaughter. So a good man to avoid. Now, if he got away from Crazy Charlie Sweeney, he ended up late in his career as playing for the St. Louis Browns, who had a crazy owner. Now, the crazy owner was keeping busy. He was involved in triple adultery at the time, but he also was concerned that he was playing two guys that said they went up to playing the game. So just like Ted Williams and Yorkie used to shoot pigeons, what Von Ahe said to these two guys, I want you to go stand on first and third base, and I'm going to see how close I can come to shooting you. But I'll try not to hit you. So anyway, I think Connor was happy to end his major league career there. And what happens very nicely is in 1897, we find him back in the minor leagues as the playing manager for the Fall River Indians. So Roger Connor, the great Hall of Famer that had gone off to have a fabulous National League career, ended up with, I'm sure, happy memories coming back for a while to Fall River at the end. Now those are the two players. The three managers are just phenomenal. There's their names, Moutrie, McGonigal, Hanlon. They are the managers that win things time and time again. The Temple Cup would be the equivalent of the World Series at certain years. But they are spectacularly successful. And you know, these three people are going to bring out the warmth of human nature, the personalities. I think 19th century, we think people were dressed in black and lived very staid lives. These people are incredibly outgoing and personable. McGonigal had a good pitching career for Buffalo in the major leagues because he had a flesh-colored thimble on his finger that he hid from everyone. And I had one, and as I said, I'm going to find it tomorrow. I had one to bring tonight that I misplaced. But that gave the ball a particular spin. And until they caught it, he was doing very well. After they caught it, not so well. Now, the interesting thing is, when he plays in the outfield, there was a New York Clipper magazine that was the sporting magazine and newspaper of the day, and it awarded what would be like Gold Glove awards, and it gave McGonigal the reward for the best right fielder. And while that was being given, there was a discussion. Gore was considered to be the fastest National League player, according to one report. And the Fall River reporter said that's not true. When they played in Fall River, McGonigal was faster than Gore. So you see what I mean? You've got two of the fastest outfielders. And I've yet to mention Hanlon, and that will be the third one. He ended up with a career-ending beaning, and so McGonigal, in the early 1880s, turned to managing, and he began to have great success, and he reported one time he was getting a shave in a visiting city, and the barber was very, very agitated as he was doing his throat, saying, that Don McGonigal, if I had him here, I'd cut his throat. McGonigal says, for once I kept very quiet. Teammates said he was the brainiest person they had ever known, that he used tin whistles and waved scorecards and bats or hats as signs to the players to move around. He was brought along to be the manager of the Brooklyn Bridegrooms, and the first year took them to second place. He dressed colorfully, and he was proud of it. I have a beautiful pair of lavender trousers with a solid gold watch. It's only a good-looking man like yours truly who could wear patent leathers in the field and get away with it without getting shot at. He had a monster gilt horseshoe for good luck. So he's funny, he's enjoyable. He is considered by many the best manager ever. He thoroughly understands the game. He acquires Patsy Donovan. What does Patsy Donovan do? Patsy Donovan learns under McGonigal, and then he manages in Boston. He's the key person in acquiring Babe Ruth for Boston. And then he goes on to coach at Phillips Andover, and he has George H.W. Bush as one of his primary players. The thing about McGonigal, going back to the thread, he's very sly, as they say. He tries what historians call gamesmanship, and so he decided to try to have an electric current run into the batter's box that would only signal his batters when a fastball or a curve was to be thrown. But one of the other teams figured that out, so then he had an outfield sign, and it was an advertisement with a dog. And the dog had two eyes, black and white, so he electrically manipulated them. The black eye would mean a fastball was coming, the white eye would mean a curveball was coming. So he's good at what he does. And in 1889, he says, I'm going to jump off the Brooklyn Bridge if we don't win the pennant. Well, his team wins the Brooklyn pennant. And now he goes up against Jim Moutry's Giants. So the old Forever guys bet themselves a pair of a suit of clothes. And Brooklyn's ahead in the series, but in the end, the Giants prevail. The Brooklyn players nevertheless surprised McGonagall, giving him a gold watch and chain and a diamond-studded pin. And they say nice things that make him blush like a bridegroom. In 1890, his team went south for spring training to St. Augustine. And I just thought it was great. I wish my cousin Frankie were here, but he anonymously sent a monkey from St. Augustine to a friend of his who was a policeman in Brockton. And the monkey escaped the policeman and was found breaking into homes. And there was a lot of interesting commentary about that. But one of the players got terribly seasick, and they're going by vessel back north, and he teams up with the practical joker on the team. And you can just imagine if you've been seasick. They arrange for the chef to come by for something that will help the poor guy that's seasick. It was an unsavory mash of smoking hot dish of fried pork. So that did not go over well. But anyway, Brooklyn won the pennant again in 1890. And so, he brought them to 2 pennants. And then what happened in 1891? McGonagall was fired. There's no sentiment in baseball. As Teddy Roosevelt said, when money comes in at the gate, sport flies out at the window. The team had been losing money despite its success on the field, and so he was replaced. He tried to gain ownership of the team, but he lost that battle with one Charles Ebbets. So Charles Ebbets becomes associated forever after with the Dodgers rather than Billy McGonagall of Fall River. He gets a chance to do major league coaching in the middle of the 1890s. He's coaching the Louisville team, and he says, I'm going to take you to the White House to meet the president. All the players say, oh, yeah, sure. Well, they walk in, and the burly Buffalonian, the president of the United States, said, hey, Mac, how are you? I haven't seen you in many years. And they have a fine handshake, and they actually just made national news. McGonagall asked him if he was going to consider running for a 3rd term, and the president said, no, Mac, I couldn't stand it. So that was big news coming out of the White House. This picture is supposed to be the fact that, you may know, the burly Buffalonian, when he was following Mac and the Buffalo teams, fathered an illegitimate child, which became a big issue when he ran for president. But then he became president and settled down and married very nicely in the White House. In 1897, McGonagall's supposed to go back to manage the Louisville team. Philadelphia offers him a chance to be their manager. He says, oh, I can't. Louisville's going to give it to me. Philadelphia fills the position. The Louisville Board of Directors go back on their verbal promise. McGonagall has to come back here to New England. He coaches Brockton. He arranges for the first Sunday baseball game to be played in New England over at Rocky Point. But, I think if that had not happened, he'd be in the Hall of Fame, because his first 14 seasons of managing, he had 7 first places and 2 second places. But what happened was he was hit by an electric trolley car, and it did severe damage to him. He never recovered from it, And in Brockton, he died at age 40, leaving behind a wife and 7 children. And 2 of the pallbearers were his friend Jim Corbett and John L. Sullivan. Now, Moultrie is even more colorful. This is Smiling James, who in his 9 years as a baseball manager had the second best percentage record to the great Joe McCarthy. And he's sort of the Bill Veeck of the 19th century. He's phenomenal. He has a great sense of talent. He has a complete knowledge of the game. He's got a wonderful personality, and he just loves people. He won a 50-mile pedestrian race after a game at Yale that was played by his Brockton team. And so he came into New York City on one of the tall vehicles, known to no one, but with his tall hat and his magnificent handlebar mustache, he went on in a decade, the papers tell us, to become one of the city's best known figures. Now, they became a tandem. He met a tobacconist named John Day. And John Day fancied himself a pitcher, and he went in a long tennis coat to pitch a game. He gave, and the new guy in town was watching. Day gave up 12 runs in the top of the first inning. And Moultrie had little trouble persuading Day that he should supply team money rather than be a pitcher. And so they became a team, and basically they created the New York Metropolitans. And the New York Metropolitans, right after that, Steph, do you have a picture? The New York Metropolitans, commonly known soon enough as the Mets, improved in quality until they made it to the major leagues in 1884. There was a second major league by the 1880s called the American Association. So the Metropolitans were playing in it, and they won the pennant with Jim Moultrie as their manager in 1884. Now, Day was also, at the same time, invited to own a National League team. And so, sort of strange, but he did own another team in New York, and he made Moultrie the manager, and Moultrie said of the team, "They are my giants." And so it was Moultrie that named this National League team, most certainly. And so these big men had created 2 very successful teams. Now, in 1886, this is a very rare action shot involving the New York team with one of the players named Dude Estabrook. Now, Bancroft may have had trouble when he was with Providence with Charlie Sweeney and Charlie Old Horse Radbourne, but I don't think he had as much trouble as Moultrie had with this guy. Dude Estabrook was odd. When they went through hotels, there was always a parrot on his shoulder. Sort of like a sentimental guy like Whitey Bulger. You know? But when he was benched for an entire World Series, he refused to talk to anyone, the coach, any of the players, etc. So there's all sorts of tension, you know, going out to Chicago, playing a game, coming back, not a word spoken. But then Duke, who was a ladies' man and quick with his fist and good with his fist, he decided that he had developed a little delusion, a flying machine. And what's tragic about it is he made himself the flying machine. And he jumped out of a moving train, out of a window, and committed suicide. And so that again is the kind of things that had to be dealt with. By 1888, Gore had achieved an incredible team. He had brought in Gore. He had Roger Connor. He had Tim Keefe. He had Smiley Mickey Welch. He had Buck Ewing. He had Jim Orator O'Rourke. I think he had the best talented team. 6 of them are in the Hall of Fame of any team at that time. And they all bonded to him. Some of them remembering playing back in the New Bedford days with Moutrie. The fans are going crazy in loyalty to the team. Lives there a man with a soul so dead, but he unto himself has said, my grandmother shall die today, but I'll go see the Giants play. So in 1888, they won the championship. During the season, prior to the Giants winning the championship, the team had gone off to a theater. And when they walked in, they were the special guests of the theater, they and the team they had played that day, the Chicago White Sox. And the audience was so into Moutrie that he said, they sang a song, "What's the matter with Moutrie?" And the response would be, "He's all right." "Who's all right?" "Why, Moutrie." So everybody, all the patrons are cheering on Moutrie. And then suddenly, there's the actor DeWitt Hopper trying to liven things up. And so he, to the fascination of the audience, is about to recite a poem, again, on a day that Jim Moutrie is the #1 attraction. The outlook wasn't brilliant for the Mudville 9 that day. The score stood 4-2, with but 1 inning more to play. And there we go, and the crowd listens. And of course, at the end, something happened.
Something happened.
Casey struck out, and the pitcher struck out. So yeah,
Open your eyes.
That's where Casey at the bat comes from, and that was and not only did they win in 1888, but they won in 1889, and again they were tremendous teams. And again, it was interesting that it was Moutrie against McGonigal in some of these competitions. But something terrible happened to Moutrie. A politician approached him for money, and he said, I ran him out of the grounds with an umbrella. And the result was the politician prevailed, and they designed a road to pass right through the center of the ballpark. And what that meant was that John Day had to come up with money and to build a ballpark further to the north that was more difficult for the fans to reach. And that was one problem. The second problem was that the players' revolt of 1890 was such that most of the good players said we were being underpaid. They formed their own league, and most of the talent was in that league. And so Moutrie used to sing out front of the park, "Where are the people?" And they'd be back, "The people are here, Moutrie," et cetera, et cetera. But before long, the singing was, "Where are the people?" because the fans were just going right by the old Polo Grounds and going to the player National League games, which were, better played. So the result was, despite Moutrie being a great manager, he and Day began to lose money, and Day had to appeal to Spalding in the National League for money to keep going. And Spalding took over and said basically, well, you'll get the money, but you're not going to have Moutrie as your manager, because Moutrie doesn't run a tight ship. He likes to be out with the boys. Of course he does. He got George Gore, Budweiser Gore from Chicago. So the end result was Moutrie, for all his success, was dismissed from the team. Day was fired from the team. Ebbets ended up owning the team. And these two people that had basically brought professional ball to New York and brought it at an excellent level ended up having very, very sad lives where they sold newspapers. They had great players like John Montgomery Moore that loved them, but they sold newspapers at the end of their life. They ended up having special benefit games to raise money for them. And Warren Harding threw out a ball that was autographed as part of raising, and Babe Ruth played in the game to try to raise money for both of them. But at the end, he was described, Jim Moutry, as a nice old man sitting on a stoop in the front of a 3-room dwelling in Brooklyn, smoking a pipe. And in 1938, he died at the Free Cancer Hospital on what was called Welfare Island. And yet, at least his obituary and his accomplishments went around the land as newspapers carried those obituaries. Well, finally, let's finish with Edward Ned Hanlon. Hanlon had a 12-year career, 1890 to 1892. It ended with a knee injury while playing at Baltimore, the same year that Charlie Buffington ended his career playing at Baltimore, so they would have been teammates. He was a moderate hitter, 260 lifetime average, but his skill was in the field. Again, he had excellent speed. So again, with the 2 others that we've mentioned, I think the 3 of them playing for Fall River covered more ground than any other outfielders in the game. He caught 2,633 fly balls in his career. You can imagine what that did to his hands without any glove protection. And again, he was #1 at that in his career. For most of the years, he played team captain, especially for the 1887 Detroit Wolverines. The Detroit Wolverines won the pennant that year and then went on to win the World Series with Hanlon stealing 7 bases. Now, Hanlon's been invited only in 1995 to be in the Hall of Fame. He was called the Napoleon of baseball managers, and one of the people that played for him would call him, Connie Mack, would call him the, I always rated Ned Hanlon, there's Connie, I always rated Ned Hanlon as the greatest baseball leader I ever knew. I don't believe any man lived who knew as much baseball as he did. Hanlon loved playing for Baltimore, and Baltimore actually was the best team in the 1890s, and they won successive pennants and World Series. And people learned under him. The most important of those people was John Muggsy McGraw, who would go on to win 10 Major League pennants. The man considered to have the vilest tongue in baseball. And so that's what we find in the 1890s. We find the Baltimore Orioles team being the best team, but a vicious, rowdy team. Sporting news. Under Hanlon orders, the Baltimores are playing the dirtiest ball ever seen in the country. They're mean, vicious, ready at any time to maim a rival player or an umpire. The things they would say to an umpire were unbelievably vile, and they broke the spirits of some fine men. I've seen umpires bathe their feet by the hour after McGraw and others spiked them through their shoes. The club never was a constructive force in the game. The worst of it was they got by with much of their browbeating and hooliganism. Spalding's Sporting Guide on the 1894 champions. Hoodlumism disgraced the season. Brutal assaults on umpires and players. Spiking or willfully colliding with the base runner. Bellowing like a wild bull. Pitcher, managers, and captains were alike guilty. Is it any wonder that the season of 1894 stands on record as being marked by more disgraceful kicking, rowdy play, blackguard language, and brutal play than that of any season since the league was organized? The league sent out a secret memo from the league office, which was hand-delivered to each team because there were so many bad examples of bad language that it was feared that the post office would stop it and charge the league with obscenity. So the players received special instructions in this fashion, and they were given some pretty bad examples that they were not to follow anymore. The cleanest example I've been able to find Kiss my butt, you son of a gun. And I've substituted 2 words. Now, this must be hereditary with Baltimore, because if you get a chance, see the YouTube confrontation between Earl Weaver and a second base umpire. It's a classic. Now, besides all that, the reality is Ned Hanlon outfoxed opponents. His nickname was Foxy Ned. He had much to do with developing the hit and run, double steal. He had a full-time groundskeeper. He made sure the infield was wet for better bunting. He developed the Baltimore chop, etc. So he was a genius. He was a genius. To finish his career, he ended up winning some pennants for playing for the Brooklyn Superbas in 1899 and 1890. They were named after the family minstrel show, the Singing Hanlons. And then he came back to Baltimore. And what happened there is Baltimore had been dropped by the National League. The American League moved in 1901, but then they took that team and they transferred it to New York and called it the Highlanders, and then shortly thereafter they became the Yankees. So Baltimore was left with minor league status when he bought the team. And he tried to get back and buy the Dodgers, but again, Ebbets blunted that. So he returned to his beloved Baltimore as a minor league city. He ultimately sold his team in part to Jack Dunn, who had played good baseball at Holy Cross, and it was Jack Dunn that would sell Babe Ruth to the Boston Red Sox. We learned from his family at the Hall of Fame induction in a speech by one of his grandsons that the key to remember about Ned Hanlon was he loved music, he loved to sing, he had rough hands, no kidding, 3,600 balls caught without glove in the outfield. He selected the Orioles colors that exist to the present. So we know all that about him as we look at this Hall of Fame induction. They had 118 descendants attend that Hall of Fame induction for Hanlon. None of them would know about the Fall River connection. We do. Thank you.